Hey everybody, my name is Ed. Okay, so we're going to do a mini-series review, and this time we're going to go back to the 80s for Starstruck. So this is Elaine Lee as the writer, creator, and the artist by Mike Kaluta. So we have number one here, which is in the wrong bag. When I repackaged them, I repackaged them in not the correct orders, but anyway. So this is number one. Number two, number three, number four, number five, and then number six. Now, there's a lot of media and a lot of like miniseries and trades and whatnot related to this property. But like I said, we're just going to do this miniseries that was put out by Marvel's Epic line in the early 80s. And but first, we'll start a little bit of background and we'll get into it in just a second. So, Starstruck started out as a stage play written by Elaine Lee in 1980 as an off Broadway play. Various comic book and graphic novel versions have been done since then. Various comics have been published over the years from different companies such as Heavy Metal, Dark Horse, IDW. Of course, we're going to be looking at the miniseries from Marvel. There was also a graphic novel from Marvel as well. The graphic novel Starstruck, Luckless, the Abandoned, and Forsake was nominated for a Jack Kirby Award as Best Graphic Album of 1985. And there's also been, I guess, a radio play version of Star Trek that was done in 2010. So just to back up a little bit, Elaine Lee is an actor and writer who began her career in the 70s. She started her acting career on the TV series The Doctors, then moved on to writing plays. Starstruck premiered as off Broadway in 1980. She's written a number of comics for Marvel, DC, Heavy Metal, and other indie comics. Some of the things that she may or may not be recognized for are Vamps, Ragman, Steel Town Rockers, Indiana Jones. I guess those are maybe some of her more well-known books. Mike Kaluta, back in the 70s, sorry, excuse me, he was a well-known fan favorite comic book and fantasy artist and commercial artist. Some of his early standout work includes The Shadow for DC Comics and numerous illustrations for science fiction and fantasy magazines. In 1975, he formed The Studio with Bernie Wrightson, Jeff Jones, and Barry Windsor Smith. And Kaluta's, like I said, done magazine illustrations, album covers, as well as other commercial art. I should probably also mention that this is part of Marvel's Epic line from the 80s. And the Epic line was a partially creator-owned imprint line, although they also did some out-of-continuity Marvel properties miniseries as well. So Marvel has stated that it was a spin-off of Epic Illustrated, which was their version of Heavy Metal magazine, which was this science fiction fantasy magazine. But it clearly was mostly to compete with the direct market that was taken off at the time and kind of compete with some of the indie companies such as First and Pacific and Eclipse, who were wooing away some of their mainstream artists with creator-owned contracts, higher production values, whatnot. Having said that, some really interesting titles came out from that line, including Moonshadow, Martial Law, Electra Assassin, Alien Legion, and a few other things. The plot of the miniseries is sort of a sequel to the graphic novel. Galakia, Nine, and Priscilla the Muscle are on the run from the powers that be. There's a bounty on their heads, and various flamboyant characters out to capture them. So there's Vera Luna, Behar Queens, the authorities, etc. So they hide out for a while on the planet Alias, while meanwhile, our old friend Harry is trying to track down what happened to a droid based on his old girlfriend. Along the way, we're treated to various flashbacks, time jumps, alternative points of view, and going back and forth between the various protagonists and antagonists. It's all kind of a power play between the authorities and the various shady groups, and all sorts of campy hijinks ensue along the way. Okay, so I did say the comic has a real kind of camp sensibility. So just to define what we mean by camp, Camp used to mean the ideal of a work of entertainment that is recognized by its bad taste, irony, or obvious artifice. These days, people tend to think of camp as just kind of over the top comedy or silliness with a self aware sensibility. Here, we do have a variety of characters that are dressing in flamboyant costumes, they behave in outlandish ways, and while the stakes are high, the narrative doesn't seem to take itself all that seriously. Humor, of course, is is a large part of camp. And if, sorry, excuse me. In this story, there's lots of one-liners, puns, and double entendres all over the place. There's many outlandish situations, but the humor, I would say, is definitely character-driven, and it's based on how the different personalities play off one another. And a lot of the humor too is about how these specific characters deal with the situations and not just the wacky situations in and of themselves. Sorry, excuse me. Okay, so um, let's see here. Well, there's a fair amount of sex, or I should say, some sex in the comic, without being actually graphic or anything. There's some slight nudity, although not too much. The characters are do seem to be sexually active, and there seems to be an attitude of casual sexuality being a positive thing. One thing that sticks out is the relationship between Molly, Harry, and Randall. They seem to be in some sort of open relationship, menage a trois type of thing. And then knowing the roots of the Pele and its creators and the time that it was originally created, a lot of that attitude seems to be, part of that whole kind of starting in the late '60s, free love, casual sex, no strings attached relationships that kind of went throughout the '70s and maybe up until about the early '80s. There's this whole thing where pleasure droids are like a common thing in this universe. Luna's got a pleasure droid. There's the droid that was based off of Harry's ex-girlfriend. Khalif Bahar has his Molly droid that's got a missing head, and there's a whole thing with his strange relationship going on there. So yeah, some interesting approach to sex and sexuality, both in the main text and kind of in the subtext as well. So there is a fair amount of strong female characters. Sometimes in today's world, people think that means physically strong or badass female characters, and there is that element here. However, by strong female characters, I mean characters that have developed personalities and motivations. Most of the action here is driven by female characters. There's a variety of characters with their own motivations. You have Galactia 9 and Drusilla, who are very different people, who are, though allies, they have their own drives. Verluna definitely has her own ambitions. You've got the Lucretia Ballar, Ronnie Lee Ellis character. Plus, I think it's really interesting that you also have the Galactic Girl guys, who are kind of like these preteen girls, and they're kind of semi-criminals, but they're also an ongoing presence in the story. But again, they've got their own agenda. And anyway, it is still very much about female empowerment, but also female friendships and even female antagonism. And it's all presented as normal, as a matter of fact. This isn't somebody necessarily trying to make an important statement. It's the work of people just doing stories about women in a pretty natural way, of course, in this campy sci-fi world. Okay, so there's also a fair amount of what we call these days diversity among the ensemble cast. We've got Randall Factor plays a major part of the story, and of course, many of the major characters, both protagonists and antagonists, are women. There's queer coded characters such as Brew and perhaps Ellis, but it's done in a way that feels informed and natural. Oh, Jesus. Okay, so the comic is incredibly dense. There's multi panels per page and lots of text and lots of dialogue. A lot of the dialogue overlaps The visuals are likewise crammed with background details. You actually have to read it more than once to get everything and to make sure which narrative or character's point of view we're supposed to be engaging with. Another interesting part of the storytelling is the use of the media. We see TV screens and news reports and quotes from fictional texts. The One character has been involved with Shady's goings on with her brothers. She's also a science fiction writer in this world under the pseudonym of Riley Ellis. Quotes from her books appear throughout and provide an interesting level of meta text, seen as it's a pulpy science fiction comic being on pulpy sci-fi. Another interesting device is the humorous glossary, which opens up the world and provides a little bit more history. And it's interesting to compare the use of media here with other comics like American Flag by Howard Chaykin, which was coming out at the time, and Watchmen by Alan Moore and David Gibbons, which came out a year later. And, just the way all three of these comics kind of use the constant presence of mass media in everyday life as a storytelling device, at the same time. So, okay, so some random examples of some art here. Some interesting use of layouts and overlaying captions. Super detailed stuff here. Some interesting action type scenes. Some really beautiful work here by Mike Kaluta. Oh, here's some merch you can buy. Okay, all right. We'll get into some more art in a moment. Okay, so here's a couple of interesting double page spreads, right?
We just came from down there.
Okay.
Really, that seemed like a land.
Well, this isn't really a double page spread, but it's interesting. It's a pretty cool layout. And here's one from the first issue that incorporates various media. Does it in a pretty interesting way that Frank Miller used in great effect in Dark Knight Returns, like maybe about a year or two later. Okay, all right. And okay, so to wrap it up, Starstruck was a stage play that got turned into a comic. It's a complex ensemble piece that's more about character and satire, but there's some fun action as well. The story is action packed with a variety of flamboyant characters and a complex romp that does contain some interesting themes and portrays progressive themes in a non preachy way. It takes some work on the part of the reader to understand it, but it's mostly worth the effort. Although it's written 40 years ago, it still feels contemporary in its attitudes concerning things like gender, sexuality, and race. And it's an experimental work in its own way. And like I said, it still mostly holds up. It's definitely worth looking into for anyone looking for something off the beaten track.